The views expressed are not those of local community broadcasting, WYML LP, or its management, volunteers, or underwriters. Greetings and welcome to the Personal Safety Show. This is Marcus Melnick from Stress to Logic, your host. And today's episode, we are going to be talking about the National Alliance on Mental Illness, which is also called NAMI, N-A-M-I, which is an organization that helps people with mental illness reintegrate into society and lead normal lives. Before I get into this, I do want to mention that a couple years ago, I was on a Fortune 500 committee, and we had to identify two organizations like NAMI to donate $5,000 with, and my job was to identify the organizations. Many years ago, we had a family member who was, I would say, a big shot in NAMI local to Chicago, and I remembered about he had been working with his son, and I was like, wow, this would be a great organization. So my organization, my Fortune 500, donated $5,000 in 2022 to the annual conference, which I attended, which was absolutely fantastic. So NAMI is a very interesting organization. It basically is the largest grassroots organization that supports mental illness and people who have diagnoses for mental illness to live healthy, fulfilling lives. NAMI envisions a world where all people who are affected by mental illness live healthy, fulfilling lives and have the appropriate community support. So on the line, I have two gentlemen. We're going to be talking to John Reed Fallon first. John, thank you for joining us on the show.
Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it. I'm always happy to talk a little bit about NAMI and its growth through the years.
Awesome. Can you tell us what your origin story is? How did you get involved in working in mental illness? What's your background, education, that type of thing?
Well, as often becomes the case, it's kind of an accident. I was a business major at University of Illinois. I originally was a wrestler and wanted to go to the Naval Academy, and then I ended up at business instead because I didn't quite get into the Naval Academy. I had applied early enough at the University of Illinois. I was unhappy to see the kind of, I didn't really enjoy business, to say the least. I'd gone in there because my father had been in business, and so I eventually would drop out of school. I went back to school because my dad was dying, and after he died, I, again, didn't really attend school, and instead went through the paper and decided where I wanted to work was a homeless shelter for adolescents, and instead eventually would start working in a children's home where I was in charge of 6 kids and eventually let them get a dog and worked full-time at $25 a day for a 24-hour day, and loved it, and eventually would go back to school. And I've been involved in trying to make sure that people recognize the strengths of individuals who are discarded often by society. And that's been my motivation all along because I've been so proud to see the strengths of everyone I've worked with over the past 40 years.
That's terrific. And I have mental illness in my family too. My grandmother, from a very early age, suffered from schizophrenia, and she was institutionalized. And as a little kid, I would go and visit her. And one of the things that I learned very early on is just because someone has a mental illness does not mean that they don't have a sense of humor, that they're not kind people. These are regular people with a different type of struggle, a neurodivergent struggle. So you started in the criminal justice field, and you've done a lot of research. Can you touch on, at a high level, what that research involved?
Well, so actually, I was really in the mental health field, and for a lot of years I worked for Thresholds, 18 in total, and during that time the executive director, Jerry Denson, was nearing his retirement, and he decided to start what was called the demonstration projects. And so there were small amounts of money, and he put me in charge of the demonstration project. So we did art shows, we did some surveys of what happened to the children when a mother was hospitalized. And the third project was to go to Cook County Jail and see the people who we never knew what happened. People would sort of disappear for a period of time when you're in the field, and then they would come out and they'd been at jail or they'd been at prison. We didn't really know the difference between jail and prison back in 1997 because it was kind of something no one paid attention to. We kind of knew people went into the criminal justice system and then they came out. And we never asked any questions about it because there was always a lot of stigma about people with mental illness anyway. So we sure didn't want to know about the criminal justice history or that they'd been in jail or prison because it was hard enough to get people housing and other things. But we did think it would be interesting. So we went in and we talked with Cook County Jail, which is the largest single-site jail in the country at the time. We said we were interested in working with people who had mental illness. We would bring a person in there if they could get us IDs, and we would work to house them when they got out. So that was sort of how it began in 1997. When we first went there, and we met with what is a full inpatient psychiatric hospital run by, at that time, Dr. Alimo. He was the chief psychologist, and he was great. Isaac Ray delivered the psychiatric, and he said, "Oh, I know who you want. You want the 2-inch files." We said, "What?" And he said, "The people who have been here and they now have 2 inches of files. That's the people you want." And so we identified individuals who had been in and out. And one of the first people we identified was a man named Richard. And we were really interested in Richard because they said he was always at the jail. And Richard was the test case. And it took us about 6 or 9 months before Richard came in. And we saw Richard come in. And we would learn that while Richard was in the hospital all the time, is what they said, Richard was also well known in the community. Richard had 137 arrests at that time and court cases. It was actually how I did that because we would go through the criminal court's records. No one really knew how to do this. And then I went out to Chicago Read and I found he had 26 inches of records and 27 hospitalizations. And that Richard was always in the hospital, according to them, and everyone knew him really well out there. Richard, in fact, we would learn, had racked up $1.6 million worth of costs, institutional costs, over the 21 years since he was 18. He had 12 brothers and sisters. Many of the arrests were for going back to the home where his parents no longer lived, including when I followed him the first time. And Richard also was hospitalized all over the city in private hospitals, though we didn't have a way to collect that data. Richard eventually was discovered down near Marshall Fields, underneath that. And one of my favorite arrests was a time when Richard was arrested for the crime of the century, which would be stealing a rollaway bed from a hotel downtown at 4 a.m. in the morning underneath Lower Wecker Drive.
Right.
And so that was the kinds of crimes that Richard was being arrested. And we helped Richard to get housed in a place we didn't normally house people because it wasn't a great place, but it was a kind of place that looked like what Richard liked because he was a person who lived, mostly gravitated to places with lots of lights and sound under Lower Wecker Drive. And so we put him in a pretty noisy place, and Richard eventually got used to that place. We visited him every day. His mental illness doesn't take the weekends off to make sure that he took his medication. And other than that, Richard could live in his apartment the way he wanted to. And after 5 years, Richard only went back to jail once for 14 days and was never in the hospital after 5 years.
That's a fantastic success story.
We went from $72,000 a year in average costs to $214 a year.
Wow, that's absolutely amazing. So you talked about getting people who have mental illness and people who are incarcerated, who are getting out shelter and living arrangements. What are some of the challenges that somebody who's in those shoes, who has a mental illness or who is incarcerated and they're getting out, what are some of the hurdles that they have to get over in order to get decent housing?
Well, you don't begin with housing. You begin with the fact that a person who has a major mental illness and who needs medication needs to be able to get the medication. And we didn't have the Affordable Care Act back then, but the Affordable Care Act still doesn't fix the issues that are adhered to with that, which is the day you get out, if you require medication, you've got to get a dose right then, or they use long-acting. And so across time, we've gotten better about giving people long-acting medication in the jail. But the problem is that you have to have a doctor on the outside. There has to be communication between that doctor and the doctor the prescribing doctor inside the jail. And it turned out that while Richard had enough medication while in jail, when released, immediately upon release, he was completely psychotic. He was seeing and hearing things because what was enough medication in the controlled setting of the jail was not enough when he got out. So he immediately was completely confused as soon as he left. And so one of the big interventions we did was to tell the jail that he's going to need more medication to be able to control his thoughts when he leaves. And then once he left, we took him immediately to a doctor to make sure that we had the medication, that it was there, that it was paid for. And so that's the first thing you do. And oftentimes people who were leaving jail would be required to go to a lot of meetings with probation or parole because we wanted to supervise people and they couldn't get to appointments. So we had to ask for special permission to have them be able to get to appointments, and we would drive them to appointments. So just getting medication, knowing that missing 2 or 3 doses may be enough to make someone quite symptomatic was part of the solution. We literally needed to meet the person at the door, get them to the doctor, get them the prescription, because those prescriptions weren't released. And there have, since 1997, been some improvement, and a few people within the jail will get prescriptions. It's still a huge problem. So that's part one, is just to maintain whatever level of stability they have in what is best described as a chaotic environment in jail. And imagine that the chaotic environment in jail for Richard was more stable than the one that he would go out in. But then you also had to make sure that you had money for rent. And if you're in jail, your Social Security check may have been suspended or ended, depending upon the length of time you were in there. It may not, your place where you were living may not be around, so you might not have that. Police often lose your identification and any money you have as you come into the jail. There is a property department that takes that, but sometimes you're arrested and your property gets taken at the lockup, which is run by the police as opposed to the jail. And there's supposed to be a whole series of ways in which that stuff moves from one unit of government to the next, but it's not always very good. You're released at that time, oftentimes at midnight or later, and you have one bus pass that can get you north or south or east or west, but not northwest. And so that was an issue. Some of that has improved, but those were all the issues we were talking about. And we wondered, so the real question we had asked was not how could someone fail, but rather how were they ever successful? It really was a race against time. And the way they often were successful was as soon as they left jail, then they'd go get themselves hospitalized in a state psychiatric hospital, followed by then being released from there, maybe not so well. And a cycle would continue, which is what Richard and many people at that time were on, this kind of cycle.
So at that, I'm guessing and I'm being a little bit facetious when I say this, there's more than just Richard. This is just an example. How many people did you have helping those who were being released from incarceration?
We had a team that eventually would have 2 teams, but originally we just had 3 of us. And we housed about 30. And those were the people who would lead to the first time that Illinois ever got a National Gold Achievement Award was for the jail project at Thresholds that I led. And there were 30 people, and we saw 80% reductions in jail time, hospital time. All of them were housed. I mean, that was our first 30 people. And so as a result, I began to speak nationally along with the executive director, Jerry Denson at the time, and later Tony Zippel, we would go all over the country and talk about this. 30 states and 6 countries came to visit our program to see, and this was earth-shaking. And we began to have people start to ask about how much time people spent in jail and prison, it became more regularized to be able to see people who are in jail and prison as just part of the community, and that this over-incarceration of this whole huge group of people have been swept up in the huge jail and prison complex, which was very expensive. I wrote a paper 2010 where it shows that we spend about $800,000 a day to house people with mental illness in our jails and correction systems.
So it's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. How did it not, and maybe just because I'm not aware of it and maybe the listeners aren't aware of it, was this adopted by governments across, you said 30 states and 6 countries, or is this still a individual, maybe grant funded type thing where it's not in the mainstream budget? I'm trying to get to it. This is successful, and it certainly sounds like it is. How come it's not more widespread? That might be politics. I don't know.
It might be. It is. And no, there are no specialized. So the specialized program that existed that we started, and I also then would go into the prisons with the second program called we were very creative in what we called it. We called it the jail project, and then we called the other one the prison project. And later, Threshold would rename it the justice projects. But we wanted to make sure that people knew exactly who it was that we brought. The problem is that when the ACA came in and insurance, so the wonderful thing is we didn't have so many people on standard Medicaid. The bad thing is we didn't have so many people in standard Medicaid.
Right.
Same thing. We've closed a lot of the state hospitals, and now we have a lot more private hospitals. And as a result of this privatization and sort of what seems to make sense in short-term thinking isn't what makes sense in long-term thinking. So we've sort of slid backwards. We now expect that everyone serves people with a criminal history. But in fact, not everyone is not everyone's good at working with this particular population to understand, and particularly people who are licensed clinical social workers and other people are using the evidence of the field beforehand instead of saying, let's just do what works. And there really was a movement with the work that I did and the SAMHSA Gaines Center. We worked hard to just do whatever was necessary. We did a lot of things similar to how a state attorney will say, well, we'll offer you this. Well, we did the same thing. We said, okay, if you can stay out of, so we had a person who had been in the state hospital 300 times and had been in and out of Cook County Jail. And one of the things that he did is when he drank a lot and he got into a lot of trouble. And afterwards, he would sort of just sit down and get arrested for eating a very large, expensive meal at a restaurant, and sometimes get violent when they tried to do something. So we said, well, you know what? We'll buy you a steak dinner for every 30 days you stay out of the hospital and out of the jail. So we gave away a lot of steak dinners to that guy. We also picked him up when he felt like he wasn't doing well. And as a result, for the first time, we were able to keep him out of the jail and out of the hospital. And that was our goal. We had, our program was pretty clear cut. We had a 1-inch by 1-inch piece of paper that said, keep the person out of jail. 2, keep the person out of the hospital. That was it. That was our goal.
It's a fantastic mission.
That singular-minded focus was what delivered us the results. There was a national study by Joe Morrissey, these kinds of programs, and they became known as Forensics ACT. ACT stands for Assertive Community Treatment. Forensics ACT, they wanted to find out which programs were the best in the country. So they interviewed 30 or 40 of these programs after they had sort of gone around, and they then figured out the 3 best programs. One program was out in California where they had the idea that they would put a probation officer on the ACT team. So this multidisciplinary team would have a probation officer as part of it. So law enforcement was a part of it. And The second team that they found effective was called PACT, the Program for Assertive Community Treatment, which was the granddaddy of all programs out of Madison, Wisconsin, a very liberal Wisconsin city. And I always joke that for their program, they'd always say, oh, well, screw the police. Let's not pay attention to the man. That was their attitude. And then I always felt, because I was the third program that they looked at, and I always felt like the best thing to do was whatever was necessary. So I always joked I was kind of like the Chicago way. We were in between. I was in favor of the state's attorney, the public defender, depending upon if it was a strong team, a strong case or a weak case, as to what the best way it was for us to make sure that we could get the long-term supervision, because it was helpful for the courts to remain involved and yet to be able to have the case go away. So people like to be able to go into court and say, I've done a good job, in the same way as drug and treatment courts discovered that a judge was a useful stopgap for them. They could come in and say, how are you doing? And they could say, I was doing okay. It was just as powerful as being in trouble. And so what was discovered was it really was about the leadership and the freedom the team had to do what they needed to do, and the drive, and what they called the charismatic leader. And so in some ways, these kinds of programs were most successful, it really was about the team, if that makes sense. So it was hard to duplicate and scale up, but we knew it worked. And there's still studies that needed to happen. And I was involved in, I went then to Corporation for Supportive Housing, and we did a large-scale study. The problem is that when you work with jails, the funding is very complicated. It's very hard to keep it sustained, any kind of program sustained. So during the time that we did the large-scale study, we did it in Chicago and Cook County. It was a $2.5 million that I'd assembled to put together the project. And during that time, Governor Blagojevich repeatedly cut the mental health centers. Cook County, during the middle of the study, after 30 years, had changed over their information system, and at one point couldn't get anyone to court. And it went for about a month and a half where the court was essentially blind as to who was in the jail and how to get people to court. And so external factors make it very hard to do a long-scale study of this very expensive group of people. I mean, you have one person who cost $1.5 million, another person who cost $1.3 million in terms of our long-term costs of these individuals. And yet there are very few, and they're hard to identify initially. So we haven't got good long-term studies, but we have short-term, small anecdotal studies in multiple states all over the country. But things like the pandemic and other things have both created opportunities for future study. I mean, we now know at that time in 1997, we now know that pretty consistently in the jails, 10% of people in the jail would have been people who we used to keep in state psychiatric hospitals, who had been caught up in the jail. And we know that in the prison system, that number was probably closer to 15%. And I imagine that the jail population has increased because of the pandemic. We've let a lot of people out of jail, and we keep saying we're going to let people with mental illness out of the jail. But in fact, a higher percentage of people tend to be kept in. And so Illinois' experiment with no cash bond is, I mean, a lot of people who were caught in that were people with mental illness who didn't have any money and who would be kept in on small misdemeanors. Hopefully that's changing. So we really need now to study what has happened to this population in the jail, as well as what's happened because medication has changed now. It takes longer for medication to take effect, and our hospitalizations are sometimes 3 or 4 days. So there's lots of things to be checked and researched, and I can't definitively say what's happened since 2010, which at this point seems a long time ago. But we are able to keep people in the community if we're very stubborn about meeting with them. And we realize that 5 days a week service is not enough. Mental illness does not take the weekends off. You need to go each day. If you know a person's not going to take medication, you need to visit them every single day, including holidays and weekends, which is what we did. And that was the real intervention. And the other 23 hours of the day, the person was able to live on their own.
So does an individual in this situation, what if they don't want help? How are you able to help someone if they don't realize that, look, maybe there is a problem?
All of them say they don't want help until they find out that it's helpful to have help. Because most people who've been helping them haven't been that helpful. So I worked with long-term homelessness, and I work with jails, and I work with prisons, and I work with mental health hospitals. And everyone always says, oh, well, there's a certain group of people who don't. No, really, honestly, people would like to live in a house. You just have to find out why. For many of our people, when we asked them what they really wanted, a large number of people wanted a TV. They wanted their own damn TV, not some donated piece of crap, but some actual decent TV. So a lot of people, we said, well, if you can stay out of the hospital and you're going to have to be able to stay in your own place and keep the door locked, and you can have a TV, we'll get you a TV. And so I'd never remembered what I'd said in the jail, but you better believe after 90 days or whatever the length of time I said, they'd say, you told me you'd get me a TV if I stayed in here, and I have. The other was a bicycle. A lot of people wanted a bicycle to be able to get to places. So we became known as a program that gave out bicycles and TVs, but not through those. Just were the requests that people wanted to do, to be able to feel like they were part of the community.
When we return, we will be continuing the conversation about the National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI. The views expressed are not those of local community broadcasting, WYML LP, or its management, volunteers, or underwriters.